Hello there. After Brexit in 2020, there are still many regulations to be made between the EU and Great Britain. And this is absolutely not an easy task. The Conservative British government has met with severe criticism with its plan to radically abolish all standards and regulations adopted from the EU days after Brexit. Not only opposition and environmental organizations, but also members of their own Tory party warn of drastic consequences. The corresponding legislative package, the retained EU law bill, was in the agenda in the British House of Commons on Wednesday. After that, it is the turn of the House of Lords, where resistance is also expected. According to the plans, thousands of laws, regulations, and standards that were adopted from EU times after Brexit are to expire by the end of the year. The Labour Party proposes extending the deadline to 2026 to protect workers' rights. The opposition party has also tabled amendments on various issues, including regulations on toy safety, animal transport, and the treatment of part-time workers. So far, the government has identified 2,400 EU laws that have been adopted after Brexit, according to a BBC report. According to official estimates, around 1,000 new laws would have to be passed to regulate the fields. Conservative Brexit supporter David fears that the law would overly strengthen the government and weaken Parliament. The aim of the Brexiteers was to give power to Westminster, not Whitehall. That's what he told to the BBC, referring to the seat of various government institutions. Environmental organizations fear a significant weakening of environmental standards and nature conservation as a result of the government plans, for example, with regard to water quality, air pollution, chemicals, or even energy efficiency. The UK government defied criticism from the opposition and some of its own MPs on Wednesday, pushing through legislation that could result in thousands of EU laws being scrapped from UK law. The Keeping EU Law Act would mean that around 4,000 pieces of legislation that had been transposed into UK law by the EU would be repealed by the end of 2023, unless the government formally declares that they will remain there. And this includes workers' rights legislation such as the Working Time Directive and maternity pay, large part of environmental legislation and internal market law. During the House of Commons debate on the bill on Wednesday, as I said, former Brexit Secretary David Davis bemoaned the fact that ministers can decide whether to bail out legislation or not by proposing secondary legislation that does not require a parliamentary vote when they want to delete, and he says it's tantamount to a dictation. In his view, MPs should be in control of this process, and this bill would just write a blank check, he said. However, the amendments by the opposition Labour Party for the deadline and to exempt a lot of things, well, of course it was rejected. It is the opposition and the others are the government, and in that system, it's likely that the bill will be rejected and amended in the upper house, which could lead to another institutional dispute between the two chambers, but it will not change much in the end. Another Brexit advocate, former Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg, who drafted the bill during Liz Truss' short tenure, he said it was one of the really important deals of Brexit. It would allow ministers to deliver on its promise to reduce the burden of EU rules on businesses. And meanwhile, Minister Nazgani told the MPs the bill would ensure EU laws do not remain an aging relic dragging the UK down. Well, that sounds very Brexiteerly. 3 years ago, on January 31st in 2020, the UK officially left the EU. A bus toured ahead of the referendum on leaving the EU, saying Brexit would bring the 350 million a week to the National Health Service. We all remember this. And just this week, nurses on the island went on an unprecedented strike to protest the absolutely appalling state of their healthcare system. As with all other Brexit promises, the infamous Brexit bus never came true. On the contrary, 3 years of Brexit have damaged the economy and above all the citizens. The financing of public services of general interest is worse than ever. The impact of Brexit has made the country unattractive for EU nurses and exacerbated staff shortages. And so this is just another smokescreen with the EU law. But today it's clear none of the Brexit promises could be kept. Recent studies really say this. Brexit has reduced UK gross domestic product by 5.5%, investment by 11%, and trade in goods by 7%. And even beyond the purely economic numbers, the benefits of Brexit are scarce. When hard Brexit advocate Jacob Rees-Mogg was commissioned to identify Brexit opportunities, among the 9 opportunities were fracking, less restrictions on genetic engineering, or the abolition of EU rules that limit the power of vacuum cleaners to 1400 watts. And that just has to be British humour. The vacuum cleaner case may sound anecdotal, but it's actually iconic. And the EU restriction on vacuum cleaner motors was introduced to limit energy consumption and environmental impact. That's an example of the success story of eco-design, which stipulates mandatory sustainability criteria for devices. These very requirements can contribute about a third of the savings needed to meet the 55% emissions reduction target by 2030. What Brexit advocates have dismissed as Brussels bureaucracy is simply climate protection. And saving energy is right now not so bad. But 3 years after the exit, the Conservatives claimed that they had checked the Brexit box sounds more than hollow. The issue continues to poison relations with the EU as well. Outstanding issues include the agreements relating to Ireland. The abolition of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of the Ireland was a key element of the 1998 peace agreement. As long as the UK and Ireland were both members of the EU, there was no need for a border. Brexit has changed that and is endangering the fragile peace. The only viable way for the UK to exit the single market and customs union is through the withdrawal agreement of 2020 and the accompanying Northern Ireland Protocol, which is an integral part of that. Since the conclusion of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, the British government has thrown its commitments quite overboard, and this led to a steady deterioration in relations. Negotiations on the customs regime are ongoing, and it's hoped that provisional agreement can be reached before the end of April this year, but I'm not that optimistic. Brexit has created countless problems for Northern Ireland. Further trade and political relations between the EU and the UK depend on their resolution. But the outlook is bleak. 2 Conservative-backed bills threaten to undo the small advances. 70% of Brits now support a closer relationship with the EU. What that might look like is still completely open. Getting there will require active engagement on the part of the UK, because the dancing around existing agreements has severely limited motivation and patience on the part of the EU. A change of government could create new political space here. An agreement to facilitate the mobility of artists, the harmonization of requirements with applicable EU law, a return to the Erasmus program, and much more would be conceivable if they keep their promises and the agreements. But what recent history has taught us is that a lot can still go wrong before the British general elections in 2025. On the EU side, cautious optimism about the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, cautious commitment and long-term planning are required. But optimism there, I don't have it. And 3 years later, Brexit is still a thorn in our side, and it's the worst solution for everyone. Brexit is a grave mistake, and it will always be. And there are still Brexiteers out there. They're still praising the benefits of Brexit. Well, yeah, scrapping EU law, that's what I said, what they're doing is a smokescreen now. They, from their point of view, they can call it a benefit of Brexit. But it will not be a benefit for the people in the UK. Some very rich people will really like to see those regulations gone. But if you want to go to a British beach in the future, if you want to talk about climate protection in the future, if you want to talk about workers' rights in the future, and they are worse in the UK already, 0-hour contracts are nothing that is allowed where I am living, fortunately. Well, I'm not employed by a company, I'm self-employed, but nevertheless, I do care about the people here. And so limiting that even more, we see the discussion about the right to strike. I'll come to that topic later today. This is a deteriorating situation for the people in the UK. And there are still people out there praising that. And all the other big promises, I mentioned the bus, just blatant lies. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.